Science Uncut, presented by the Volkswagen Foundation.
We start off the conference by two keynotes. The first one is given by Helen Margetts. Helen is the director of the Oxford Internet Institute, and there she's a professor of society and the internet. Her research includes topics such as digital governance, big data and public policy, and political behavior in the age of the internet. Her current research project she is participating in include ways to use data from social media to predict election outcomes, the impact of web-based technologies on government practice, and performing laboratory-based experiments in the fields of economics and political science. Her most recent book is Political Turbulence, How Social Media Shape Collective Action, which she has written together with Peter John, Scott Hale, and Taha Yasseri. Helen's lecture today is titled Political Turbulence, How Social Media Turn Political Mobilization Upside Down. We will learn how tiny acts such as sharing and liking content on social media can up to huge political resonance. Helen, it is great to have you here, and we're looking forward to your keynote. The stage is yours.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here in Hanover. As Florian said, I'm a political scientist, so I'm probably in a different tribe from quite a lot of you, but I know this is a multi-tribe conference, so I hope that's okay. And what I'm going to talk about, the data I'm going to talk about, the kind of evidence I'm going to talk about, comes from this book that Florian mentioned, Political Turbulence, which was an attempt to look at politics through the lens of the digital, and particularly to look at collective action and political mobilization, such a core concern of political science, and to try and think about the relationship between collective action and social media. And to tackle this question, for an audience for a specialist audience like this, it's a truism to say that our lives are intertwined with all sorts of technology, and particularly, to a growing extent, intertwined with social media platforms. And what does that do, if anything, to the practice, the theory and practice of collective action? And how do we research it? Because the way that we are doing research is changing. The very existence of this conference is a symptom of that. So just thinking about social media platforms for a second, social media platforms are where politics play out. They may or may not be what got Donald Trump elected, but the fact is that they are where every single one of us, it's where we acquire political information, where we discuss politics, where we make any kind of decision about whether to participate in politics, and increasingly where we do participate in politics. So our understanding of social media platforms is kind of crucially important, I believe, for understanding politics in a digital world. Facebook, now people have been wishfully predicting the demise of Facebook for many years, but as most of you will know, Facebook now has around 2 billion users, and it's not going anywhere just now. Facebook is certainly an integral part of of many political systems right across the world. It's by no means the only social media platform, and I think it's especially important to note that the average teenager in the UK and many other countries in Europe is active on an average of 5 social media platforms. And we know far less about these platforms than we do know about the ones that are easier to study. So although there are more users of Instagram than Twitter, we have far less research on what politics looks like on Instagram than we do on Twitter. Snapchat, a relatively new entrant used by 60% of 16 to 34-year-olds in the UK. There's incredibly little research on Snapchat, but anybody here like me with teenage children will know that they literally exist on it. So there's a fair chance that it's going to be important to their political lives in the future. Now, the key driver of the argument of the book is that social media platforms stimulate very small acts of participation, of political participation, and by virtue of their very smallness, these acts are something new. As people go about their lives on Facebook or Snapchat or Instagram or whatever, they are continually invited to undertake some tiny act of participation. That could be liking something, sharing something, viewing something. It could be signing a digital petition or automatically generating some kind of email or digital letter. And the point about these acts is that they are so small. They are so small that they kind of extend traditional study of political participation, views a kind of ladder of political participation where you've got something very extreme at the top of the ladder, something like, I don't know, dying for a political cause would be right off the top of the ladder. But it extends that ladder at the bottom. It introduces things that in an earlier era, the transaction costs relative to the participation costs would have just been too great to undertake. There's no pre-social media equivalent to retweeting something concerning some social or political issue. I believe that that's drawing new people into politics, particularly young people, in the same way as Instagram has generated a whole cohort of micro-influencers who generate some small amount of income on Instagram from allowing advertisements on their feed or something like that. It's drawn a whole cohort of new people into politics, and it's interesting because it's a group of people who, for decades in political science, we've been bemoaning that they were not interested in politics, i.e. young people. And it's important to stop for one moment there and say that this is not an uncontroversial thing to say in many political cultures, particularly the UK, but I imagine in Germany as well. We very much in the UK have a politics as pain principle. Politics is supposed to be boring. You're supposed to go to long meetings. You're supposed to tramp the streets. You're supposed to get wet. It's supposed to be unpleasant in some way. Just clicking something or doing something very small doesn't count. It's clicktivism or slacktivism. It's to be in some way approached in some kind of pejorative way. I'm asking you if you're a member of that kind of a member of that approach, to just sort of suspend your disbelief for a moment and think for a moment what it actually means that so many people are doing very small new things in politics in ways that they haven't been possible before. So sometimes, as Mr. Kroll mentioned, sometimes those very small acts scale up to something really massive. Of course, those people in Tahrir Square in Egypt at the March of Millions are not doing something small. They're doing for something very, very large. They're risking their lives. But to get there, the process by which that many people got on the square, the process by which that many people believed that this was a viable movement, that they weren't going to be a part of a very small group on the square, that there were going to be masses and masses and millions of people there. The process by which they got there took place on social media. It took place on pages like We Are All Khalid Said, where people got tiny signals. The fact that it was nearing 500,000 likes was a signal to them that this was something large, not something small, that it had scaled up, that it was going to tip over into the kind of critical mass necessary to make a difference. The Podemos movement in Spain, starting on social media, scaling up to a really disruptive element of the Spanish political system. Again, something that is composed, or at least in the beginning was composed, of huge numbers of very, very small acts. But they nearly always don't. And we've got a massive selection bias here in what we see about political mobilization, because we only see, of course, the ones that succeed. Nearly all political mobilizations online go absolutely nowhere. Nothing happens. This data represented in this graph is data based on signatures to petitions to the UK government, every single signature to every petition over the last 5 years. The dark red ones are the ones that got less than 500 signatures. The yellow ones at the top are the ones that got over 100,000 signatures. And in the UK, on the UK petitions platform, that's enough for a parliamentary debate, to generate a parliamentary debate, or at least it has been since 2012. What that graph shows, basically, is that nearly everything fails, that 0.01% of petitions actually get over over 10,000, sorry, 0.01% get over the 100,000 necessary for the parliamentary debate. And that is a kind of phenomenon that's replicated over and over again on social media platforms. Most Facebook posts are never shared. Most tweets are never retweeted. That lonely feeling you get when you spend ages composing your 140 characters and then nobody tweets and nobody retweets it, nobody likes it. You're not alone. Well, you're not alone in that anyway. So it's a very generalizable phenomenon, this point that most things don't go anywhere and a small number of things go very dramatically. What makes some mobilizations successful and some not? We use that data, which is, to me, although it's not big by scientific standards, rather sort of epitomizes the idea of a big data set because it's every single signature to every single petition over a set period of time. It's real-time transactional data that represents a sort of N equals all population. So it's very useful data from that respect. Well, one thing that doesn't determine what succeeds and what fails is the issue. You've got 3 numbers there. They represent 3 petitions against the badger cull in the UK. 3 petitions that badgers like this one have reason to be grateful for because it was widely perceived as actually bringing about the end, or at least a temporary cessation of the badger cull. One of them got over 100,000, one got 10,000, one got less than 3,000. Very similar petitions, round about same sorts of time, similar wording even on the petitions. Difficult to tell why one succeeds and one fails when there's so many similarities. What we can tell from this data is that the rise is very quick, and the fall of attention to any one of these petitions decays very quickly indeed. That's what this graph shows, and this data shows similar data for the petitions platform in the US, the We the People platform, which is still languishing there in the White House, although I very much doubt if the current incumbent of the White House is doing very much to respond to petitions at the moment. But there you see a very similar pattern, that if petitions haven't made it in a very short space of time, then they're not going to make it. If they haven't done it in 10 hours, they're probably going to be digital dust. And you can see that in converse, how the successful ones develop very fast indeed. Obviously, that's the other side of that coin. So this shows the ones receiving more than 100,000 signatures straight up, straight away. And then settling down. Just to that's for petitions alone. But these are YouTube videos showing a very similar pattern. The rise over time in views of YouTube videos from the highly serious, that's Neda Aga Sultan, the face of the Iranian protest in 2009, who was shot, and this was a video of her after being shot and was taken down ultimately because it was so distressing. But you can see going straight up to nearly 1 million views and then tailing off. Infinitely more frivolously, Obama singing "Call Me Maybe," that surprise hit of 2012, again straight up, and then going much more slowly. And then a kind of, well, these are logarithmic scales, so it's not stasis, but going up much more slowly. What was very interesting to us here, I mean, one of my motivations for starting to write this book in the first place was to test some of the models of the economist Thomas Schelling, where he argues that if thresholds for joining something are normally distributed, then you will get some kind of S-shape of mobilization. That you will see the accumulation up to some kind of tipping point, and then you will get the vertical bit of the S, and then you will tail off at the end as you reach kind of saturation of the population. We've looked everywhere for S-shapes in this data. We've argued over S-shapes, and we have had to come to the conclusion that this is not what we've got here. S-shapes is not what we've got. This pattern is replicated over and over again. Where you do see something which looks different, as in here, this is the video of the black man killed in police custody in New York, Eric Garner. What you see here is a rapid rise up, then some stasis, and then another rise at failure to indict the police at whose hands he died. So it's not anything like an S-shape. It's actually two of these two curves in succession. And again, these are all various of the hashtags that were used by the protests against policing in the US, this time on Facebook and Twitter, again showing this kind of two-stage process, but two curves that look very much the same, straight up and then leveling off quite rapidly. Obviously, we have to have something about Donald Trump. This was a petition in the UK to block Donald Trump from entering the UK. This is actually before he was elected. We had another, even better one more recently after Theresa May went to see him and invited him back for tea. And there was a big movement to block a state visit for Donald Trump, which had actually nearly 500,000 signatures, I think. This one was a little bit more modest, but has gone soaring over 100,000 signatures. And there did have to be a parliamentary debate on whether Donald Trump should be barred from entering the UK. There was another petition there not to ban Donald Trump from the UK, exhibiting a similar sort of pattern. And last petition here, this is the petition which I suspect anybody from the UK in the audience might have signed. I certainly did myself, and indulged in a spot of activism with it. This was a petition straight after the referendum to leave the European Union, asking that the referendum should be rerun if the result was close, as indeed it was. Interestingly, this petition was actually started by a far-right group called a right-wing group called the English Democrats, because they thought the result of the referendum was going to be completely different from what in fact was. So this was a sort of preemptive move before the referendum, saying that it should be rerun afterwards because they thought they were going to lose. Obviously, for people who wanted afterwards from the Remain side wanted to rerun the referendum. It was handy to have one already there because it takes a bit of time to set it up. So it was hijacked, and you can see that must be one of the biggest petitions in history, I'd say, with 4 million signatures. The far right was so unhappy about this that they did actually hack the petition and almost destroyed it, but it was restored by the good people in the Cabinet Office. There you can see a similar pattern. So it was rolling along with just a few signatures before the referendum, and then straight afterwards went whizzing up while some of us were at the Computational Social Science Conference in Northwestern last year, which was just after the result came up. So you can see, I do believe that what I'm talking about is an enduring pattern that we are seeing across political mobilizations, across countries, across social media platforms, and therefore it's worth thinking about and thinking what the implications of that are. One of the implications of this sort of behaviour is that what we are seeing is a kind of leadership without leaders. What I've been trying to say is that it's very, very difficult to get, 1 million people into a square or a huge, massive mobilization like this one in Brazil. But if it is done, it's possible to do it without any of the normal organizational trappings of a movement or a mobilization. This movement in Brazil, the then President Dilma Rousseff asked to speak to the leaders and was told, well, there's no one for you to meet because there are no leaders. And again, this is a phenomenon that we have become familiar with, the idea that there's some kind of, there are movements which are leaderless, which don't have organizations. One of the reasons why so many of the revolutions of the Arab Spring were disappointing, were so disappointing, was that there were no embryonic political parties waiting in the wings or kind of leaders in waiting, precisely because they've been able to get going without that. Likewise, where institutions do exist, those institutions are being challenged, strongly challenged, by the waves of support that develop in this way. If you think of, Jeremy Corbyn, leader of the UK Labour Party, having a bit of a resurgence in the polls at the moment in the UK from a very low base. But there are many people arguing that the Labour Party will never recover from the kind of propelling of Jeremy Corbyn to leader on these kind of unpredictable waves of support that we saw. Will the Republican Party in the US ever recover from Donald Trump? Will the Spanish political system, which had 2 goes at a general election last year, recover from Podemos? What will it look like post-Podemos? Again, will the Democratic Party recover from the surprise surge of Bernie Sanders? Again and again, our traditional, conventional institutions have been very ill-suited and ill-fitted to cope with these kind of massive and sudden, rapid and unpredictable rises in support. And I think you could argue that what you're seeing is a kind of collective action without collective identity. The way we used to think about political mobilization and social movements was that people with a similar interest would somehow find each other and coordinate together and act or develop some kind of mobilization or movement in pursuit of their cause. And I don't think that is often what you are seeing here. You are seeing people act. Okay, they're very small acts. They're kind of negligible acts in the kind of politics as pain culture. They don't really count. But those acts are having an effect. When they scale up, they have an effect. And you're seeing the acts take place before the collective identity. So these are people in a German football stadium. You could say, well, they do have a collective identity because they're supporting the same football team. Actually, I have to confess, I don't know which one it is. Okay. So they do have a collective identity, but they're not acting in the pursuit of that collective identity. They have come together to put up that sign saying refugees welcome. But the collective action here was all those people who shared that photograph across social media networks, which will have had an effect. It's impossible to think that that won't have affected the stream of the decisions of some of the stream of refugees of the summer before last, when they saw that here was a country where they could actually be welcome. Remember that people fleeing war-torn countries prioritize mobile phones even over food and water and blankets. It is seen as the most indispensable item when fleeing your country. So it's impossible to imagine that didn't have an effect. And yet, the people who were sharing that and contributing to that action were in no way coordinating with each other or knowing each other or having some kind of collective identity. And I think we're seeing that very starkly in the UK election campaign at the moment. So in the referendum of last year, people voted to leave or remain in the European Union. And although there were many people who were very kind of committed to one side or another before the referendum started, there were just as many people who were undecided, who maybe made their decision at the very last moment. Clearly, there were a lot of people who made their decision at the very last moment. And yet that act, once they'd made that decision, you could argue now forms kind of their collective, their kind of political identity in the current election campaign, far more than partisanship or alignment, which is the traditional way that we think about identity in election campaigns. So I think already we've seen a kind of shift away from collective identity and towards the act itself driving the sense of identity, such as there is one, and often there isn't. So just to sum up there, what I'm saying is that tiny acts of participation can scale up to something very, very large and important, but almost always don't. But that distribution, that new ecology of mobilization is really transforming our political landscape, and we really have to think about that if we want to understand politics. We have to understand this kind of leaderless, institutionless, institution-destroying sort of mobilization, where people are acting first and identifying later, if at all. We have to accept that many mobilizations and waves of support are unstable, unpredictable, and often unsustainable. And that's leading to what we call political turbulence, hence the title of the book. And in calling it political turbulence, we hope to go a bit beyond just a metaphor, because what we've been observing is something that looks rather like a natural system. We were looking at a political system, but we felt that what we had found was something that was a lot more like a natural system than earlier kind of depictions of political systems. We've got unpredictable behavior. We've got very high sensitivity to initial conditions, that sort of starting moment. You've got non-linear relationships. Obviously, you've got very high interconnectivity. You've got a kind of something that looks like a chaotic system. I'll come back to that at the end. But something that looks a bit more like a natural system, that might be looked at more like a natural system. And of course, people have said that many times before in the history of sociology, the idea of some kind of science of society. But these days, any sort of collective action generates data like we've never had before. And I've shown you some of it, which I do believe I believe that that data set of petition signatures is data like we've never had before as political scientists, political science has traditionally been a kind of bit of a data desert, really. We've had opinion surveys about what people think they did or think they might do, and we are ever more becoming conscious of the fact that they're quite often completely wrong about that. We've had very few other sources of data to understand, with which to understand mobilization and collective action. Now, we can't always get data, and I'm sure that will form part of the discussion later and over the next 3 days. That's why we know so much about what's going on Twitter, because it has an open API, and so much less about the platforms, the other platforms that I've talked about, such as Facebook, Snapchat, and Instagram, particularly Snapchat, which after all, as it purports to delete all data as soon as it's read, even if it did have the data available to give to researchers, it wouldn't possibly be able to say that it did, because it would be kind of violating its whole identity. That allows us to describe political mobilization. It allows us to look at underlying trends in political behavior, and there are some quite interesting ways that researchers are using to do that. It might allow us to do prediction. There hasn't been enormous success with using, for example, Twitter to predict the result of elections. There's been a bit more success, actually, by some of our colleagues with Wikipedia data, but I mean, not really. I think we're really in the foothills of what we might do with machine learning and predictive tools to understand, to predict political behaviour into the future. What none of that does, what nothing that I've shown does, is allow you to really kind of explain what's going on or to make some kind of causal inference. So I do think that a vital task for political science research into the future is going to be experimentation of various kinds. That could mean experimentation in the lab, experimentation in the field, and also a kind of natural experiment that is revealed in the data. And I'll talk about one of those in a second. But when it comes to explanation, I think some of our traditional research tools, our sort of tools for how to research projects, are actually kind of broken when it comes to looking at the kind of landscape that I'm kind of putting to you. So the traditional way we've understood political behaviour, for example, is demographics. You know, kind of young people are less likely to vote, or at least since it's been a progressive decline in young people's political participation since the 1950s. And there are various other kind of demographic arguments about how your demography kind of shapes your political behaviour, that are how we try and understand what's going on. They are likely, if acts of participation are so small that they're almost costless, if they're just kind of a click away, then the kind of resources you have, the education you have, the socioeconomic status that you have, will perhaps be less important in shaping your political behaviour. So I think we are seeing a kind of shift there going on in about how we look at political behaviour and what determines our political behaviour. And that we're going to have to look for something else if we want to understand, for example, how it was that hundreds, thousands of young people propelled this guy, Jeremy Corbyn, one of the kind of most traditional figures of the political establishment, i.e. a stroppy Labour MP who's sat in the same seat for 43 years and thought the same things and behaved in the same way for literally over 40 years, that thousands of young people propelled him into being leader of the opposition. If we want to understand that, we're not going to do it, I think, with the kind of tools that we've traditionally used. So what might we look to? Well, I would argue that we have to look for the kind of influences that are in play on social media platforms. And I know that's what lots of you are doing, and this is just a kind of extension to that, to the political world. And in the book anyway, we argue that there are two key drivers on social media platforms that are kind of influencing what people are doing. One of them is we see a heck of a lot more information about what other people are doing. If you sign a petition in the street, then you don't know how many other people have seen it. The guy holding the petition might say, oh, everyone's signing it. Or they might have sheafs of paper, but you don't know what's going on in the next street or in the rest of the country. On social media, you know all the time how many people have done something. Likewise, visibility. Being kind of visible in any political sense or visible in the pursuit of some sort of political cause has in the past been really an elite occupation. Now you can be visible to a few people. You can be what I called a micro-influencer earlier on. You can have a bit of visibility, and some very ordinary people manage to get a lot of visibility. An example of a movement where visibility was the driver was probably the Ice Bucket Challenge, if you remember that. A much maligned but actually rather successful way of raising money for motor neuron disease research. Much more successful than it was really portrayed in the press. But the whole driver of that campaign was visibility. It was shaming. It was people saying, I nominate so-and-so to pour a bucket of ice water over their head in their garden, and somebody feeling that they had to do that and then nominate somebody else. If you want to think about the power of visibility, just think of the numbers of the Ice Bucket Challenge, the number of people who did the Ice Bucket Challenge, and the number of people who then went on to donate money when, of course, they weren't visible. I think it was about kind of a sixth. So that's an indication of the importance of visibility, even in that quite successful example. So if you look on Facebook, you will see, and Twitter, you will see everywhere the number of people who followed, or who followed, who've liked, the number of followers they've got, the number of friends they've got, anything that happens, anything that you do. We know from decades of social science research that those little bits of that social information is an important driver to how people behave. We know that if people know that lots of other people have given to charity, they're probably more likely to do so themselves. If lots of other people have voted, they're more likely to vote themselves. We know that opinion polls make a difference to how people are thinking about election. There is a great deal of research in both political science and economics showing that. So it's probably fair enough to say that on social media that's going to be important in terms of guiding people's political behaviour. I'll go quickly because I know that I'm running out of time. So this is the petitions platform that I was talking about before, the UK government petitions platform, and that's showing what's interesting here is that the UK government changed this platform a few years ago. They changed it to have trending information because they thought that would be cool, and it would be more like Twitter, and at the time that seemed quite a cool thing to do. They didn't actually think it would change the way that people sign things, but they thought more people would sign petitions and that it would generate traffic to the platform. Now, I'm showing it because it's an example of a natural experiment where that change happens, and because we've got data before and afterwards, we know we can look at the effects of that change. And all over social media, there are experiments like that going on all the time. The question is being able to capture the data before and afterwards. So there's the platform, there's the trending information. What happened? Well, here's the number of signatures per day. You can see that the idea that this was going to generate more signatures didn't materialise. Same number of signatures before and afterwards per day, not significant difference. But what did happen is that the distribution of signatures changed, and as many of you would have predicted, the more popular petitions became more popular, and the less popular ones became less popular. So it changed the distribution, and you can see could well contribute to the kind of patterns of mobilization that I was showing you before, because things that become popular become very popular, and the things that don't. Goes some way to explaining that sort of phenomena. It's the same sort of phenomenon that Duncan Watts and Matt Salganik and colleagues have looked at in cultural markets and the popularity of songs. It explains instability, basically. It explains why some things become inexplicably very popular, and I think we can apply that to the political world. Now, very different environments on Instagram and Snapchat, and I mention that just because, I don't want to make it seem as if it's really easy to get natural experiments from everywhere, and also to point out the difference that design makes. So, for instance, in that trending example, in fact, I don't know how to go backwards, but it doesn't matter. But in fact, it wasn't evenly distributed, the difference that it made, because of the ways that the petitions were shown on the page. Any human-computer interaction people among you will know that people tend to focus on the left side. And so actually to be third was just as good as being second, because you were more likely to be in the eye of the person doing the signing. Design really makes a difference. So the design of whatever social media platform is popular at the moment is going to make a difference to politics. Instagram there's got quite a bit of social information going on. Snapchat, on the other hand, it operates in rather a different way. There isn't much social information. It's much more about sort of making you feel special and like you're part of a group, that only you know what the group is, and much less social information. So I think there's some very interesting questions to ask there about what that means. Also, some very important questions to ask about political advertising. This isn't live, so I can't press it, but if anybody comes across that advert about young people liking Donald Trump on Snapchat, I highly recommend clicking through and watching that little video. I mean, it's really scary, but it's something that anybody interested in politics should know about, really. So design makes a difference. The design of a social media platform is shaping what kind of politics we get. That's very important for the future of politics research. I won't go into that. That was a lab experiment that we do cover in the book. If anybody's more interested, what it basically shows the same thing for visibility. Snapchat and Instagram work far more on the visibility driver than they do on the social information driver. So looking at the effect of making people visible in certain sorts of ways, I believe, is also an important experimental task for the future. Here, we asked people to contribute something in a public goods game to a simulated public good, and then we varied whether they were visible or not. What we found was that being visible did make people contribute more. There was no doubt about that, but it happened in a rather inefficient way. Otherwise, that is, they would contribute to things that had already got enough contributions. That's not very efficient. And also that different sorts of people respond differently to visibility, and that's something that I think we're going to have to look at on social media platforms. Different personalities respond differently to social information and visibility. What we found here was that people who can be characterised as individualist social value orientation as opposed to cooperative are actually very, very shameable. All of them contributed more when they were made visible. That's quite interesting. If you want to get money out of bankers, make them as visible as possible. I mean, that's the kind of takeaway you might have from that. But it suggests a sort of avenue of research that perhaps lots of us ought to be thinking about in terms of thinking about personality as shaping your political behaviour in some of the ways that demographics have traditionally been deemed to do. So these are just a bit of summing up. If we want to research all the kind of pathologies of social media that are being discussed at the moment in probably any country that anybody here comes from. I mean, it is worth noting that in social media are, of course, as I'm sure you're all aware, blamed for absolutely everything that happens in the news. It's not possible. You don't have to count to 10 before any atrocity or bad thing happening in almost any sphere of life is blamed on social media, but these things have all been very squarely attributed to social media. I think that's somewhat debatable. But if we really want to answer those questions, if we really want to understand what's going on here with the phenomenon of fake news or filter bubbles or the effect of political advertising on social media platforms, if we want to understand hate online and the extent to which it's a new phenomenon or it's just exposing society's dark secrets, to the extent that we want to understand where computational propaganda and bots are actually making a difference to elections and making a difference to people's views and behaviour, then we're going to have to do these kind of things. And that's going to be a real research challenge, actually. I mean, I don't know about any of you, but I'm not writing any research proposals that don't include Facebook ads or better, Instagram and Snapchat ads. But, you know, what are the ethical implications? How can you do that in an ethical way? That's going to be a real question for all of us and a real kind of shift for research. There's real sort of policy challenges is here, just before I end, that I wanted to flag up. You know, how do political institutions kind of cope with changing political behaviour, both for the good? How do they capitalise? Because a lot of people are engaging politically or engaging with policy issues in a way that I don't think we've seen for a very long time. That's in a way exciting, but traditional political institutions, our governments, our large political parties, our policy-making bodies are very ill-qualified to sort of cope with that. How can we regulate in this world? How can we regulate elections in this world? The UK Electoral Commission is self-confessedly completely at sea here. How can they monitor local exposure? Have strict rules on local expenditure in UK elections. But the UK Electoral Commission has more or less kind of confessed that it cannot control local national spending on local targeting. That has completely gone beyond its kind of capability. So it spends a lot of time kind of investigating whether people sent nationally a bus to one constituency or paid for hotels for central staff in one constituency. But there's far more going on social media platforms that they are unable to even kind of think about, really. And so really, policymakers, just like as researchers, are going to have to build capacity for researching this kind of turbulent landscape. Just as, of course, as we are, and that may mean policymakers and researchers perhaps working together more closely than they have in the past. And I think Florian said that something about that at the beginning. You know, we're going to have to think more about how we work together. We're going to have to think more about how we work across disciplines. I know I don't have to say this to this audience. Since being here, I've met a physicist and a cultural sociologist and may well be working together for all I know. The authors of my book are two political scientists, i.e. me and Peter John, a computer scientist, Scott Hale, and a physicist, Taha Yasseri. We all know that, but you know, the question of mainstreaming of that, making that possible in mainstream political science, sociology, anthropology, right across the disciplines, and across the natural sciences as well, of getting natural scientists to understand how much they need social science and the arts and humanities, is going to be a task for the future. We've got to get hold of data. We're going to have to start, well, people like me are going to have to start talking about all the wonderful data that we actually can't get, which is held entirely on proprietary platforms like Facebook. And it's interesting to think in what other market Facebook would have been allowed to buy Instagram and WhatsApp. But, you know, they are kind of holding the key to understanding politics to a very large degree, and I'm sure there is here as well in the UK. There's big kind of undercurrents of dissatisfaction and moves to try and do something about that. I think all the tools of data science, of what we're calling social data science or computational social science, are going to be necessary to understand politics. Also experimentation. I don't think you can't leave experimentation out. Developing an ethical framework for all this is going to be part of the science. It's not going to be an add-on that we fill out a form and just learn where to tick no and not applicable. It's not going to be like that. We're going to have to build an ethical framework. Some of us are already, but we're going to have to move faster than that, I think. And of course, as Florian mentioned, theoretical development lags behind. For us, that means sort of turning the political turbulent idea and our encapsulation as a political system, as a natural system, more into a theoretical model, a model of democracy. We've called it chaotic pluralism, and that's what we're working on now. But I know that's going to be part of the discussion later on, so I shall stop there. Thank you.